Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called Non-Dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Tina Rasmussen, who is one of the most accomplished meditation practitioners in the Buddhist tradition anywhere in the Western world. Tina began to meditate at the age of 13, and in 2003, after many years of practice in Buddhist and modern non-dual traditions, she was drawn to undertake an intensive year-long solo retreat, during which a profound awakening to a deeper reality occurred. In 2004, Tina took refuge with Tibetan Dzogchen teacher Tsoknyi Rinpoche and was initiated into the Nyingma lineage. And in 2005, Tina attended a 2-month retreat with Burmese meditation master, the Venerable Auk Sayadaw, who ordained her as a Buddhist nun. And during this retreat, Tina became the first Western woman to complete the entire detailed shamatha path in this lineage, including mastery of all 8 jhanas. She was later authorized by Auk Sayadaw to teach. After these life-changing experiences, at first, she felt a strong pull to become a cave yogi and turn away from the householder life. However, over time, the possibility of functioning from realization while living in the dynamism of the modern world became a more compelling life's path. Tina then began participating in Hamid Ali's Diamond approach, also known as the Ridhwan School, a contemporary wisdom path designed for householders that integrates the psychological and the spiritual into one continuum for living in the world, but not of it. Tina now leads retreats and offers spiritual guidance and mentoring to practitioners worldwide. She has a Ph.D. in human and organizational development and worked as an executive coach and consultant in the business world for more than 30 years. She is also the author of several published books. So this is an amazingly accomplished human in multiple domains of life, and it's a wonderful conversation that you're about to hear. It goes quite deep, and so hopefully it will be useful for you, and you might be learning many new concepts, but I take time to relate them to what you might already know as well. Enjoy. I'm here with Tina Rasmussen, Ph.D. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks, Harish.
Yeah, nice to have you on the podcast. And I want to say right off the bat, it's an honor, really, to be speaking with you, because as listeners may not know, you are one of the most accomplished practitioners in the Western world of, the Western adoption of Buddhism and related traditions. My impression is, yeah.
You may be overstating that, but thank you. That's very kind.
And it's, beautiful that you didn't set out to become one of the most accomplished practitioners. It just somehow happened along the way, right?
Yeah, that's really true. I had a very strong flame for awakening. That's really what was behind everything, and that led everything as well.
Yeah. So if you could share about your journey, starting from whatever point feels most relevant to kind of how you ended up here teaching what you teach, sharing what you share, and what were the most kind of pivotal moments on that journey. just doing the sort of greatest hits of your spiritual autobiography?
Well, I was born in, no, I'm going to give the short version, not the
Okay.
long one. Yeah. So really, it started, I look back at this now and it is kind of, I can see the miraculousness of starting to meditate at the age of 13, which just, and I know you started very early too. And I was delighted reading your bio and seeing there was some similarities there. But I just wandered into the chapel in the Methodist church that we were going to at the time outside Chicago, and I was 13. And my story now is that it was hippie and coming back from somewhere in Asia, had learned to meditate. And I sat down and I listened to the instructions, and that's when I started meditating. So, it was really such good fortune, because as a teenager, things can be kind of stressful. And I really was just doing it for practical reasons, but it started me at a really young age. And then in my 20s, late 20s, I got really interested in going deeper with different traditions. And I worked in Santa Barbara right across from the library. So I'd go to this one aisle that had all the spiritual books and just was reading books from all different traditions, just like devouring it. And I just couldn't get enough. And around that time, I went to my first weekend retreat, the Vipassana retreat, which happened to be with Jack Kornfield and somebody who's become a friend who was in teacher training back then. Deborah Chamberlain Taylor was in training with him. And I was just hooked. Once I started actually getting a taste of that deeper possibility, I started doing longer retreats, more retreats, ended up over time doing a month-long retreat every year. And that was really when that burn for awakening got going, because I tasted it all the time, and I just didn't want the retreats to end. I would cry at the end of the retreat when we broke silence. I was the only one in the room crying. Everybody else was like, woo, And I also started practicing Tibetan Buddhism at the time, and I did have a Hindu teacher at one point. So I was, sort of checking out the landscape, as we all do nowadays. But the retreats were what really drew me. And I wasn't reading anything then. I really didn't want to read anything. I wanted it to be all experiential. Plus, I was working on my Ph.D., so who wants to read more at that point? And then at 40, one of my teachers, and also in the Tibetan cave yogis, there's this tradition of going in and doing solo retreat for long, long periods. And I could do it. I was single. I was working full time as a consultant, had my own business. So it was a huge deal to give that up, to tell my clients I'm doing a year-long solo retreat, and I didn't know if I'd be able to function at the end. Really, the hardest thing, my biggest concern was I thought I might lose my sanity, honestly. And once I accepted that, yes, that could happen, and I might end up, living on the street or something, I accepted that. It was like, okay, whatever it takes, And I'm not from a wealthy family, so it was, I was 40, 39, and I didn't know if I'd be able to come back, even if I didn't become mentally unbalanced. I didn't know if I'd want to, but I still had to support myself. So that was really when the big shift happened, was during that year. And then I got out, and one of my teachers said, I think you should really study with Auk Sayadaw. Some of what happened during that year related to what he was teaching. So I went to his first retreat that he taught in the US for 2 months, and that's when I completed the Samatha path. And hundreds of people around the world.
That was a 2-month retreat?
It was a 2-month, in California. And I didn't know that people knew. Auk was telling people because it was so unusual. And by the time I got out, all these people knew and wanted help, and I had a full-time job. I had no intention of becoming a teacher. But I wanted to give something back. So that's really when I started teaching and the book came out and so on, and been teaching ever since. So
And just to clarify, because you're being humble here, the unusual thing was that you completed the evidences of mastery of all 8 jhanas in that 2-month time period, which no Westerner, or at least no Western woman, had ever done before. Is that right?
right, yeah, they were very. I mean, in Auk's years of teaching, there's only been a few people who have done that, and so I was the first Western woman, and there'd been, I think, 2 men before me, 2 Western men. One was a monk who had lived at Auk, and the other was a lay person. And yeah, so it was. I didn't even know at the time how significant it was. I just was there for my practice. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned about this fear of like, oh, maybe I'll end up a crazy homeless person, because I think every serious meditator has to face that at some point. This
That's
is
true.
this is what
Right.
the mind does. It generates, and it's this very slight chance that it could happen, but it's almost always just a mind generated fear, and it's almost always that I could just end up a crazy homeless person.
Well, I didn't have a single teacher who was willing to guide me on the year-long retreat, because they were afraid I'd have a psychotic break, and then they'd be on the hook for it. So it wasn't 100%, uh,
Safe.
out. Yeah, yeah. But I did find somebody who had had a very big awakening, who had been a friend, and he agreed to mentor me, just sort of ad hoc. And I did go to some retreats during that year, so it wasn't like I had 0 in-person
Yeah.
guidance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if anyone listening thinks, oh, I want to do a year-long solo retreat, you need to have somebody checking in on you who has
Yes,
experience with this stuff. Yes.
absolutely. I had, I mean, now I look back on it and I think, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? I don't know that I could do it now.
Yeah.
But that urge, I could feel that awakening was hovering around me, and it just didn't matter. It didn't matter if I died. It didn't matter. I just had to do it, and the universe came together so beautifully to support it. I had so much support. I had a friend who we had a deal every 3 days. I would just send an email or just call and not leave a message, just so that he knew I was okay. And if I didn't, he was going to come and make sure that I was okay. And I never needed that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I feel like that's when it really happens, the big shift. It's when your longing for the truth is stronger than your fear of death or insanity.
Right. Yes, it takes, there is a way where it's like, an awakening or bust kind of thing. And not that that's any guarantee it's going to happen, because, now that I'm a teacher, I can see a lot of people have strong enlightenment drives. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but in some ways it doesn't matter if it happens or not. That's how I felt. It doesn't matter what happens. I just have to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, see what you think of this. It seems to me that the longing for awakening always bears fruit. But when the awakening is being conceptualized as a kind of object, something to attain, that can delay it from happening for quite a long time. Would
Oh,
you agree?
absolutely. I worked at this all the time with the jhanas. I teach longish retreats, and it's one of the main things, because the striving of that, like in Buddhism, there's considered wholesome and unwholesome desire. And wholesome desire, I mean, if we didn't have that flame for awakening, which I call the enlightenment drive from the diamond approach, we'd be sitting on the couch watching TV, and not caring. And so there needs to be that longing. But when it tips over into a striving, that is actually a defilement in consciousness. It's egoic. And basically now our spiritual practice has become just a vehicle for egoic pollution in the consciousness. So that line has to be really worked carefully to have that longing stay with the purity of the desire for awakening, rather than like, okay, I'm going to awaken, and now it's all about the me. That just is what's getting in the way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it can even be on the other side of things. It can even be, maybe you've experienced this, getting sort of pulled along by your own longing, whether you like it or not. And you have moments where you see the person sitting on the couch watching TV, not caring, and saying, "Oh, lucky person," because I am just
Yes.
compelled.
Yeah. I'm kind of in a mode right now where I feel like there's just this sucking in process that is just, it's happening on its own. And yeah, I work with people, you probably do too, all the time, who they feel that pull, and it's beyond them in a way, and they're worried about, am I going to be able to keep my job and my significant other, and all that has to be worked with. And but ultimately, the people who really feel that burn, you can't stop, because it's more important than anything else. It's more real, it's more true, it's more compelling. And you get a taste, you want more. It's a virtuous cycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another thing is, like, so many people have heard teachings from Buddhism or classical yoga about detachment and dispassion and disinterest, that they worry, oh, if I wake up or become enlightened, will I care about my kids still? And I
Yeah.
find myself reassuring people, no, that's that love that you have for your kids, that's something that awakening wouldn't cancel out. What it might cancel out is your attachment. They have to turn out this way, not that way, but it won't cancel out the love. You would agree with that, I'm sure.
Oh, totally. I agree completely. Yeah. I mean, we don't know what is going to change in our life, and there is a truth there, but that to me is something that would never get canceled out. The love, it becomes different though. It's like, I like to hold that whole aspect of what happens as non-attachment, where it's not that we don't care. Non-attachment, like, it's not a non-caring, it's that there's a sense of things arising that we are not, the me isn't in control of. So that's where we're not suffering now because of the attachment. But that doesn't mean that love and caring about certain individuals over others. I mean, this is, to me, one of the most mysterious things is, why do we feel a certain love for this person over that one, even though they're both equally the ground of being, 100% equal in that way? There are particular individuals that there is something, and that's children, romantic partners, friends. There's something beautiful about the particulars being important too.
Yeah. And that's why it's like, if awakening were capable of destroying a relationship or a marriage, it would only be a marriage in which you were faking it but not admitting it to yourself. That kind might get destroyed.
Yeah, the authenticity the authenticity factor just keeps going up. But I'm sure this is true of you. I have many friends who are on the path of awakening. They've been with their spouses for 30 or 40 years. No issue. And their partner isn't even on the path at all. And it doesn't matter. And I have, a whole array of friends. Some are on the path, some aren't on the path. Doesn't matter. But the authenticity, that is the part. If you're faking it, like you say, there comes a point where it's hard to fake it.
Yeah. Or even impossible.
Impossible. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So would you say, in terms of non-attachment, is it fair to say that non-attachment is the same thing as acceptance of impermanence and acceptance of lack of control?
Yes, I would say those are the same. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so then we can put it in a positive language too of acceptance.
Yes, I was just using the Buddhist language.
Of course,
You know
of
how the
course.
Buddha was. He didn't like to say what anything was. He only would say what it wasn't.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but yes, it is, to me, those are the same. Acceptance or even surrender. Those all sound like a doing, but they're, you know, they're a state more than a doing, even though they're words that sound like now. Because you can't, like, okay, now I'm going to force myself to surrender. It's not possible. It has to come from the inside, but we can incline there. And we can see that we suffer when we do resist. I mean, I am a Star Trek fan, and it is like the Borg, resistance is futile, you know? And reality will keep showing you the places where that a clinging is causing suffering. Yeah, but the
Yes.
caring doesn't cause suffering. And that's why what you said about the children. We can love more deeply. We can care more deeply. And there's also that non-attachment, say if that person passes away. I mean, I had a partner who passed away totally unexpectedly a year and a half ago. No warning. And yet that doesn't affect the capacity to love. So, you know, or like you said, how someone turns out or what they're like, that kind of non-attachment allows for deeper relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
So let's come back to the 8 jhanas for a moment, because some of my listeners won't be familiar with these, although they've been getting more popular, I could say, in spiritual culture these days. There's a lot of people interested in the jhanas. 4 jhanas with form, 4 formless jhanas. You've been through all of them. And I have a question about this, because in the lineage that I study, or in more than one of the lineages I study and practice in, but one particularly called the Krama lineage, there's this emphasis that altered states of consciousness are not necessary on the spiritual path, and indeed might be a problem because you could attach to them. And that what we are looking to realize, the fundamental truth or reality that we're looking to realize, is present in every state of consciousness. It's present in and as the most ordinary states of consciousness. It's the, whether we call it the formless ground of being or Rigpa or Paramashiva. And so there's this danger in chasing after extraordinary states of consciousness, altered states of various kinds, because they're fascinating. And fascination with states can lead to clinging and then bondage and dependency. So how do the jhanas function ideally, or how is it for you? Like, what benefit was there to going through that process, and how did you avoid attaching to those states, and how did they help stabilize your awakening, if they did? Because I believe this happened after your big awakening shift.
Yeah. So what you're saying is in Buddhism as well. Everything you said, the jhanas are controversial, and they were probably even controversial in the day of the Buddha, and we're not going to solve it anytime soon. So just to acknowledge that everything you've said is part of Buddhism. And I also teach Dzogchen, in which there is one person I've told that is teaching the jhanas in the Tibetan tradition, because it is in the Tibetan tradition. I have a very, very thick book on it in the Tibetan tradition. It's the same as Theravada, no different, because these are empirical realms that consciousness can access. So I agree with you that they aren't necessary. So I would agree with that. I don't feel that they are required for awakening. Are they an asset? Yes. And this is why the Buddha, pretty much every time somebody asked him how to practice, he first pointed to samatha and the possibility of the jhanas, because if they are accessible, it's a huge asset. So then this is how it's taught from Auk, who also teaches Vipassana as a path all the way to awakening as well. So just to say that.
How are they an asset?
Yeah, so they're an asset, and I would say they've been controversial. I think part of why they've been controversial, and even in the day of the Buddha, some people could attain the jhanas and some couldn't. And that's how it is now, and maybe someday with the neuroscience we'll know why. Because people who can still attain awakening can't attain the jhanas. It's based on concentration. So just to give my simple definition of jhanas, jhanas are non-dual states based on concentration. So when we experience a jhana, it isn't an altered state. It's a state of non-duality, just like any other state of non-duality. We're accessing the grounded being. We're just doing it through concentration. So I'm not sure what could be dangerous about that or addictive. And if we find that we're getting into cycles of desire and craving, striving for jhanas, then we work with the defilement of greed, just the way we would if we wanted a Lamborghini. It's no different, So if a person is attempting to do that practice, I work with this all the time. You have to work with spiritual materialism. So that's how we do it. It's no different than any other type of greed. Why is this in a different category than every other type of attachment that's causing suffering? It's no different. So we just work with it the same as we'd work with everything and admit it. If that's what's arising, it's going to block it anyway. So, but the why it's significant, there's a talk I give on the dimensions of non-duality, and this also relates to my work with the diamond approach, that in Buddhism, so there's what's known as the form or material jhanas, and then there's the immaterial or formless jhanas. And the immaterial jhanas they are realms beyond the physical that our consciousness can know directly. So they are dimensions of non-duality. So when we are realizing those, we are realizing a different flavor of non-duality that gets progressively deeper all the way to the absolute, which is the deepest dimension of nothing, of there being nothing, which isn't exactly right because it's the ground that everything manifests from. But there are progressively deeper and deeper states, and that is what we're accessing through concentration, potentially. So the benefit is that, first of all, the samatha practice is like building a muscle that's a faculty that can be used in any other practice. So even if somebody cultivates the samatha practice and doesn't attain jhana, they just don't have that faculty, which again, I believe it's true. Even like in the day of the Buddha, there were some who could and some who couldn't. Just developing that faculty is going to give a person a much more powerful capacity for practice. Say we're realizing non-duality in other forms, like in Dzogchen, where it's momentary, or in the non-dual traditions, which I've also studied in. Like I studied with Adyashanti for a long time, leading up to awakening. Those tastes of non-duality, how are those going to be sustained if we don't have the faculty of concentration? Somebody might be able to realize it in momentary glimpses, but it can't be sustained unless that faculty is developed. So the jhanas are different because they are a method of realizing non-duality that is sustainable, rather than it being, that, and I'm snapping my finger, momentary glimpse. The jhana has the potential for it to be sustained. Like the longest mastery I had to do for Auk Sayadaw was 4 hours. So that meant I had to sit down, had to have the capacity for it to arise and not move or fall out of it for 4 hours. That is super helpful off the cushion. Because if I want to get up and walk around and function in life from non-duality, there has to be a powerful concentration and a really thin me for that to be possible. So the jhanas thin the me through the direct power of consciousness that is not veiled. People think the term purification of mind is a euphemism, but you can feel it. It is powerful. It thins the me that way, but it also builds that faculty of being able to maintain non-duality and getting acclimated. Like also the consciousness is getting acclimated to being at that level of subtlety. So it is actually a purification that is palpable. So that to me is the benefit. If somebody has the capacity and feels drawn to it and they can access it, that is why it's beneficial. And I think, this is, and also we're getting tastes of, like, there are 4 categories of practice I teach, and each category has different benefits. One of the benefits of the samatha, what's called the focused attention category in neuroscience, is that we're orienting to what is beyond the physical realm, even just in the form jhanas. We're orienting away from the body and materiality to the mystery. And that is powerful because with our breath is coming directly from the mystery in a way that is mysterious. Like, why is one person alive and another dead? The breath is really the distinguishing immediate factor. So when just in this really simple act of orienting there, we're like declaring an intention for the mystery. And when people do this practice, they lose body awareness and other things. I mean, this is one of the things why you also want to do an embodied practice too, like Vipassana. But when we get to the point of death, it's going to be really good to know experientially what we are that isn't the body, that's beyond that. So there's a lot of benefits to the samatha practice, even without jhana. It thins the me. I've had 30 or 40 year Vipassana practitioners come and say, I had more of a sense of insight into personality patterning doing this than I did doing 30 or 40 years of Vipassana, because it's hard. It's a hard practice just staying with that little tiny area of the breath. You're going to see your personality patterning in glaring relief. So that's really the benefit for people who even don't care about jhana. The samatha practice has so many benefits. When I have Dzogchen people come to my 2-week retreat, a lot of them end up doing samatha the whole time. They don't even do Dzogchen because they realize this is what I need. I can realize Rigpa, but I can't sustain it. And the samatha is what lets them sustain it.
Yeah. Okay. So now I have like 10 more questions.
Yes, and that's my 5-minute sales pitch on the samatha practice.
So in your experience, going through the jhanas helped your awakening integrate into everyday life in a more sustainable and stable way. Is that correct? Is that what I heard there?
Yeah, well, I had experienced the first 4 jhanas prior to that. I was part of an experimental group at Spirit Rock who was being taught concentration, They were a small group in the sea of Vipassana yogis at the month-long. And I had been taught it using the Brahma Viharas. So I had already experienced that before awakening, just to say that. And so doing it after, I learned a much more robust method that Auk teaches, which I felt was more stable and more complete, more robust, and easy to discern exactly where you're at. There's no ambiguity there. So I feel like there was clarity about what had actually happened. And then in terms of awakening, yes, I feel that the long hours, I mean, what I did all 10 kasinas and all 8 jhanas. So you can, and I had to do the mastery. So this was 2 hours continuously in every single kasina, all the way up to 8th jhana. So just the hours that were spent doing that were...
Just to clarify, because I'm not clear on this, are there 10 kasinas in relation to each jhana?
Yeah, so when one is the way the sequence in the Auk teaching, you start with Anapanasati, and that's only is an object that works up to the 4th jhana. So then at that point, there's a whole method for being able to see if a person can possibly attain the upper jhanas, which isn't that common. And then if that is possible, then one goes back and starts with 1st jhana doing all 10. These are different objects. Kasinas are objects that where one in the mind's eye sees a certain thing, a color or one of the elements. And then that object is used to work up to work through all 8 jhanas. So do the progression up to, if possible, the 8th jhana. And they get progressively more and more refined to where the hardest one is the light, or is space. So you're taking space as an object, which is extremely subtle, as you can imagine, and difficult. So that is the progression that I had to do when I was doing the 2-month retreat. Yeah. So just spending that many hours doing it. I mean, I can see why, like in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, they're basically teaching the same practice. I mean, this is what the Buddha learned from his teachers. And I can see why people can't function doing that. Because if that's your main practice, you're so far outside of the physical realm. I mean, it took me a long time to really integrate that and come back to what does it mean for living, and to have consciousness come back into the body. And I really didn't have a lot of help with that, because Auk doesn't care about that. He just wants you to get off the wheel of rebirth. So when I asked him about embodiment and integration, he didn't care. He said, no, you ordain. That's what he said every time I asked him about integration or embodiment. So
the solution is remove yourself from the world. Don't integrate into it.
Exactly. So this is where, I mean, a lot of my teaching, I am huge on embodiment. And I'm trying to find ways to help people really work the living side, because these traditions are old, and what we have is psychology. This is what we have in our era that they didn't have. And which
helps make integration possible.
Exactly. Yeah. We're so fortunate that we have that, because we can also understand how to thin out that personality material that's remaining, which usually there's quite a lot.
So if any listener wants to learn more about the jhanas, you have a book with a lot of detail. But let's also remind the listeners that, as you said, they're not actually necessary. You can go through the awakening process without experiencing the jhanas, but they are very helpful, I would say, for people who want to experience more of the range of reality, meaning to say, most people don't even suspect that these states of consciousness that you call realms, non-dual realms, boundless realms, and they can absolutely, the difference between those two is non-existent at the level of experience, state or realm. But that's extraordinary for some people that to experience. Oh, there's so much more to reality than I had guessed. But that doesn't make it strictly necessary.
No, and there are other ways. I mean, this is why, so the 4 categories of practice that I teach are heart practices, including bodhicitta and the Brahmaviharas. The focused attention, which I talked about, samatha with using anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, open monitoring, which is vipassana, and also shikantaza and zen, and maybe there are equivalents in your tradition. I don't know enough to say. And then the self-transcending category, where we're going right for the non-duality. So that would be including the modern non-dual tradition, Advaita Vedanta. I would think your tradition has that, and also Dzogchen. So in the self-transcending, all of those can lead to non-duality. These are all 4 pathways up the mountain that, to me, for a well-rounded practice, we want to do all 4. So all of them can lead to non-duality, to awakening. But like the self-transcending category, the difference is we don't need that level of concentration. We can realize non-duality more at a more momentary level of having those tastes, which is why it's not required to have the level that's required for jhana. But if somebody has even first jhana, I asked Auk about this. I said to him, do you think everyone can attain jhana? And he said he thought everyone needed to at least try. Because for one thing, it's going to thin out the need just doing the samatha practice dramatically and make your life better. But if even first jhana is possible, doing the other practices becomes so much more effective to have that level of concentration. So
and well, it's also, even the first jhana can be liberating for someone to experience for themselves that there's a way to generate pleasure or happiness or bliss, however we translate piti, internally, independent of your external circumstances. That can be a liberating thing for someone.
There's a whole healing component to the purification that's happening. And I'll just say that there are a number of different, lineages within the Theravada Buddhism that are purporting to teach the jhanas. They don't all agree, just like in Vipassana, they don't agree. And some of them, I feel, are actually teaching access concentration and not jhana, because the PT, all of that happens in access concentration. We don't have to have jhana for what I now am calling the access concentration factors to arise. Even doing Vipassana, those can arise. So just to call that out, that what I believe is being taught out there widely now as jhanas isn't actually jhanas. It's access concentration. So I know all this is controversial.
Like by that, you mean like the ability to access that state of bliss, or the ability to access a state of pure presence, but you're not necessarily immersed in it to the point of the separate self dissolving. Is that the difference?
Yes, it isn't non-dual.
Yeah.
The non-duality is really the main thing that's important about jhanas. The bliss and all that, those are great byproducts. So in Buddhism, there's 3 levels of concentration. Momentary, which is when we're on and off the object. That's where we all start. Access, which is where we're starting to be with the object for 5 minutes to 30 to an hour without really going off. And that the me is gets more and more dormant, and what's called jhana factors, or I call them access concentration factors, arise. And they are, when it first happens to a person, people are blown away, because it's like, I couldn't make this happen. Like, if you say to somebody, okay, generate bliss right now, they can't do it. It's a byproduct of the concentration and of the me thinning. So that in itself is extremely healing. And in Vipassana, people experience this all the time, even though jhana isn't possible with an open monitoring category of practice. So the thing about absorption level, that's the third level. With absorption, that's where the me goes dormant and non-duality arises. And that has other benefits beyond the bliss and the other things that can happen, because we're getting used to being without the me. And that is a tough threshold to get over. And a lot of what I am hearing called jhana, they don't even talk about non-duality. So they're teaching access concentration. And of course they don't know, because they haven't experienced true jhana. So until you've experienced it, how do you really know the difference? It's like, and I'm going to use a crude example, but I think people get it. Like, if you're having sexual pleasure, it is super enjoyable. How would you know if you've never had an orgasm? But when you have one, you know the difference. That's the difference. And the people who are teaching the access concentration, it's wonderful. I'm glad people are having access concentration, because there's so many benefits. But to call it jhana is technically inaccurate, and they're missing the non-duality. That is the thing that's significant about jhana, is the non-duality.
Yeah. Okay. And if we extend the sexual metaphor a little bit, it's like you can have an experience in lovemaking, if we use that term, right? Where, I am one with you, and you feel this connection, but that's not yet the true oneness, because in the true oneness, there isn't even an I to assert that it is one with the other.
Exactly. Yes, that's a great addition. I'll have to remember that. If I usually don't use this, but when I was interviewed by Time Magazine, I had to tell her this, and then ask her, please don't print it, because I don't want to be like I don't want to be that teacher, but but it's really the best metaphor out there, because it's like, how would you know otherwise? So yes, thank you for that addition about the love and the oneness, which isn't the same as non-duality. Feeling like you're merged with a partner in love, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. Everybody should have that, but it isn't the same as non-duality.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something not a lot of people understand, that merging, the feeling of merging is not non-duality. And even though it's wonderful. Yeah.
Exactly. I love that. Thank you for adding that.
So just to clarify something, because you're talking about these jhanas as non-dual states, or non-dual modes. And of course that's true, because there's no otherness in the jhana. And in my tradition, there's this interesting distinction that's made between non-duality, any state or realm in which there's no other, and therefore there's no self, right? Because the self and other arise together. And by contrast, what they call supreme non-duality is the non-duality that is all-inclusive, meaning to say, sense phenomena can arise, thoughts can arise, emotions can arise, all of this can arise, but there's still no otherness, which is thought to be more advanced of a state or realization than one in which there are no sense. Like if you're in the jhana of nothingness, there's not phenomena. You're not noticing all these phenomena. You're merged with nothingness, right? So, and that can be preparatory to this all-inclusive non-duality that they call Paramadvaya, the supreme non-duality, because it doesn't exclude any phenomenon whatsoever. It's all-inclusive. I
Yes,
don't know. Yeah,
absolutely. And I should say, jhanas are not awakening.
great.
Jhanas are not awakening. They're states. Our eyes are closed. We're not in touch with the world. And that's one of the benefits of them, because we're really going beyond, but they aren't awakening in my tradition. In some traditions, the eighth jhana is awakening. So I'll just say that, in my understanding. So I agree with you 100%. The way I would frame that, like one of the things I've observed as I've worked with people through the awakening process, the first stage is there's tastes of awakening. Like I'm having an awakening experience, and that is amazing, because this is what happened to me. Maybe it happened to you too, where it's like, wow, there's a whole reality here I never knew existed. And I want more of that. Like, how can I get more of that as soon as possible? This is how people feel. And it's wonderful because it keeps them coming back, because it's so compelling. It might be like the most compelling 1 or 2 seconds of a person's entire life when that happens.
Yeah.
So it's our own nature calling us, And then the next stage in Buddhism, there'd be like no self, where we see the self is a mental construct. The me is a construct of the mind, and it feels empty. So there's an emptiness of no self. And then there's non-duality, where no self to me is not awakening. It's an experience. And then we have many experiences, at some point the identity shifts to where we know we're the grounded being, we're not the me.
And that's first stage.
That would be first stage of stream entry, yeah. But then there's a whole process. I like the Theravada model with the 4 stages, where the me just gets less and less. There's less suffering, less identification, less defilements, so on, less personality patterns. But then I think what you're pointing to is where there's a whole process of everything getting included. Everything. The garbage can, your least favorite politician, a war, an awful crime being committed on an infant, beautiful ecstatic states. All of this is included. There isn't anything that isn't included. And that is a long process, because there's some things we don't want to include because we don't like them. And the mind can't reconcile how these things are happening. But ultimately it all gets included, and it can't be done through the logic of the mind. It's all experiential. Yeah. So is that kind of what you're saying about the further stage, where everything ultimately is the ground that you are?
Yes. And it's all happening in direct experience, meaning to say this is something that so easily confuses people. Like you were just giving these examples of what's all included, but it's not at a theoretical level, as you said. It's experiential. So whatever arises in experience is seen to be simply an arising of, whether we call it Buddha nature, essence nature, Paramashiva, it's an arising of the formless ground as experience, or an appearance of the absolute as whatever's being experienced, which is very, very different from a mental theoretical inclusion of like, oh, everything's part of God. I'm believing that thought now. Oh, but can I believe that infants being harmed, that's part of God? You don't have to believe that.
Right.
It's because the belief is potentially pathological, whereas the direct experience doesn't impede skillful action.
Right. Yes, everything arising, it's all experiential. None of this can be known through thoughts about it, or reading about it, or theories. Those things can help understand, and they're pointers, but without the direct experience, it's not real, it's not lived, it's only an idea. And that's why we have all these practices that cultivate that direct experience potentially. And when we know it, this is where the dimensions of non-duality, like there's, in my understanding, and this does, one of the things that I found so incredible was that the understanding in Buddhism maps directly onto the understanding in the diamond approach. I've even got a chart when I talk about it where I've got arrows pointing to how they're understood exactly the same, and the sequence is a little different, but like in the non-conceptual realm, everything has a perfection that isn't logical. Everything is just perfect, just as it is, even with all the crap. And logically, that makes no sense. But at an experiential level, there's a peace in that. Doesn't mean we don't go out and try to help the world get better, or go march for human rights or other things. Yeah, that's part of it too. But underneath, there can be an equanimity. That's really what it allows, is if I'm going out and I'm trying to make the world better, I'm not doing it from hatred. I'm doing it from love of all of being, every single part. And that is a very different energy to go and try to make the world better. So the equanimity doesn't mean that we don't keep trying to make the world better. And, activism, all of these things, if a person feels drawn to that, it isn't necessary, but if a person feels drawn, it's coming from that knowledge that even with the imperfection, there's a perfection that we can't know from our limited human perspective, but we can experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we try to talk about it, anyone who hasn't yet experienced it will almost compulsively, project a mental understanding onto what's being described, and it's always wrong. It has to be directly experienced.
Yeah, it's true. It is. It's one of those things, like sometimes people will say, oh, that's all, those are all ideas like book learning. They're not. They're experiential. The experiences, fortunately, can be put into words. And I believe that all experiences can be put into words. I didn't used to feel that way, but with the diamond approach and Hamid's sort of understanding, which is different than some traditions, as long as the words are following and not leading, it can at least be attempted. And that, is the finger pointing at the moon. The finger's never going to be the moon, but at least it can help for people who haven't experienced it. It can inspire, and it can also help people make sense of something after. Like, I've had so many people come to me because I teach with all 5 dimensions of non-duality. Every religious tradition can be included. Like, why are they all different? Well, because they're pointing to different dimensions of non-duality. Like, I've had Christians come to me. I had a Catholic nun come to my retreat once. She was an amazing meditator. But what does a Catholic do if they have an emptiness experience? There's no context for that. Or if a Buddhist has a divine love experience, and their teachers will say, oh, just ignore that. That's nothing. And this is like the most profound moment of the person's life, and it's just devastating. I mean, I've had people come to me and, like, translating it, they just will weep because it's like, oh my God, this can land now because they can actually understand it. So you're right, it all sounds theoretical until the experience happens. But it's not. These are describing direct experiences that are beyond the mind and beyond concepts.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems to me, if there's one tragedy in human life, it's to never experience anything beyond your own conceptual mind.
It is. It's so. I mean, to me, it is one of the greatest tragedies because, the vast majority of humanity, I don't know, when I talk about this, I would estimate that it's maybe at the most 0.5% who are on a path and have that drive to know something deeper, and the other 99.5% of humanity will never know that. I mean, I feel like my hope is that those of us who are on the path now, even if we haven't realized our deeper nature, just being inspired to try to know that more, we're like with machetes cutting through the jungle of consciousness of the ego self, trying to make a wider path for those who come after us, you know. And think about the Buddha and those who were before him and all of our teachers who, I mean, I don't know how they cut a path through so long ago, you know, but maybe we're cutting a path so that those who follow in the thousands of years, hopefully that humanity will survive behind us, it'll get a little easier to realize, and there'll be more teachings, and the teachings will be better, and the psychological will be integrated. And that's my hope, at least, that over time, more people, this would be a paradise. The physical reality would be a paradise, even if everyone was just practicing, not even awakened, just practicing, because we have enough material resources for everyone.
Yeah.
This would be a paradise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of percentages, you know, I would suggest that actually quite a substantial percentage, not the majority, but still a substantial percentage of humanity has somewhere in them a longing for truth that has never been nurtured. I mean, humans being social creatures, right?
Yeah.
We need to hear somebody, almost all of us, we need to hear somebody highlighting that, acknowledging that, and praising that longing for truth in order for it to sprout and grow. And so, you know, there could be so many more people on the path, but they don't get that longing acknowledged. You know, if a child expresses it, and so many children do, and it
Yeah.
gets
Yeah.
quashed almost immediately. Oh, stop dreaming or whatever. What are you talking about? And
Right.
so, from that perspective, we actually live in the greatest era of human history so far, because people can find, if they just look a little bit, they can find something um, that will meet their longing, that will speak to them.
Yeah, I agree completely. I agree that this is the greatest time for the potential of humanity because of that. I mean, in the old days, you could only get what you could walk to, you know, or ride a camel or a horse or something. I mean, it was so limited, and now it's all right there. All the world's traditions are right there at our fingertips, and we can find it. And I think there are more people waking up these days, more householders. We don't have to be monastics anymore to really have a deep practice as a householder. So it is the greatest time. And that, I would call that the enlightenment drive. And, you know, the other three instinctual drives we have as humans, the self-preservation instinct, the sexual instinct, the social instinct, which all mammals have, including us, that we need to survive in these body things. You know, we need all those drives to keep us alive in a body. But that enlightenment drive is the fourth drive that for some people it's very strong. And for others, like I love your image of a little sprout coming up. It's just a sprout that if somebody, like I've run into people who maybe they had a non-dual experience, they wouldn't have called it that, but it was an experience that was so memorable that they remember it for years after. And it was a taste of that if that had been cultivated, like say they had found a teaching that could help them understand that, it could set, or it did set them on the path. And that's why they're coming to people like us, you know, but I believe that probably almost everyone on the planet has had a moment like that because it's their own nature.
Yeah.
It's been there every second of their lives. So they realized their own nature, but they didn't know what it was, so it couldn't land.
Yeah. And it's something about us being such social creatures. when we bring that moment to someone else and they dismiss it, then
Yeah.
we instinctively, bury it until it can't be buried anymore. Sometime later in life, it just wants
Right.
to re-emerge.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I find sometimes people later in life, they have more time for these things. And with sort of end of life being closer, people can get really motivated. And then they might remember these experiences and like, oh, yeah, I've had several of these. I just had forgotten them or didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, gosh, so much to talk about. Can you briefly take us through your 5 dimensions of non-duality? Because I'm curious about that.
Oh, sure. Well, let's see if I can do the fast version. Okay, well, we've got the physical realm, which we can debate whether it's real or not, but let's just call it the physical realm, where we're here, we eat food, we interact, there's the planet and the universe and all that. That's not one of the 5. And then there's the 5 dimensions. So I'll just name them and I'll briefly describe each one. So the first dimension, which is the closest to the human experience, is boundless love or divine love. And the traditions that have a theistic are pointing to this dimension. But even people like I've had Buddhist practitioners who had this and didn't know what it was. The heart practices in Buddhism are pointing here, but they don't call it out. And this is really where we experience that everything is an emanation of love and is love, including ourselves and all other beings. And it's very, this is where when traditions talk about, God gave his only son for the benefit of humanity and so on, you can see where these things come from. And it feels often like, even for someone like me, that I could see why people would feel there was a God with that dimension, because it's also the closest to the human realm where our love is personal. It's for a person. So when, like, I've had people come who they might experience this realm and they might think maybe they've fallen in love with someone, maybe who isn't their partner, and they're just projecting this dimension onto a person because they don't know how to experience it impersonally. So that's the first dimension. Then the next one I would call pure presence. In Buddhism, it's called the base of boundless consciousness. And this is
Which is
really
one of
where,
the jhanas as well, right?
which is one of the jhanas. Yep.
Yeah.
So this is, well, it's one of the jhanas, but there's a realm in Buddhism that is just a realm of existence, that whether jhana or not jhana, it exists as a realm. That's how it's understood. So this is where everything feels like an emanation of presence, like it's the Shakti. It's just full of life. Like you would look around and everything would just be like bursting with aliveness, and it's just exuberant. Like you might even see things as emanating like a glow, or even the air feels like it's got presence in it, like it could almost be a little thicker. And that is the second dimension, and it's not empty. It's about presence.
Everything
So
is full of presence.
well, yes, and unity. Both of these have more of a unity tone to them. They're about everything being one unity, either of God or of presence. And now then we get into more the emptiness. We're moving more to the emptiness zone, where that's a little more predominant, or a lot more. The next dimension would be the base of neither perception nor non-perception in Buddhism, or also called the non-conceptual realm. And this is where it's starting to feel much more empty, but still very bright, very clear. There's a sharpness. This is what Zen is pointing to.
Yeah,
And
it's that utterly pristine clarity in and as
yes,
everything. Yeah.
yes, exactly. This is the realm. Everything, it's the isness, the suchness. It's perfect without saying why it's perfect. Because look at all this imperfection. Even the imperfection somehow have a perfection that we can't know with the mind, but we can experience it. And it's crisp. And so Dzogchen, I'll just say, covers both pure presence and the non-conceptual.
Yeah, and in this non-conceptual realm, nothing has its own independent essence. Everything is simply that clarity shining, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it's getting more and more empty here. So in this zone, like sometimes I've heard people, like one time when I was young, I used to get that magazine, What is Enlightenment? Remember that? And there was a cover story that this guy thought everybody was automatons. Well, he was stuck here, where it just feels empty. Like you can see that people are acting out of their program. But if it gets too far on the emptiness side, that can become its own kind of distortion and suffering, So then the next dimension is what I would call the absolute, or in Buddhism, the base of nothingness, no thingness, where it's completely, and this is the deepest dimension. So how do we then have a fifth one? I'll get to that in a minute. This is really, in my understanding, the ground. It's to say black isn't even, that's too much of a thing. There's no color, there's no movement. It's still, that like dazzling dark of nothing.
Yeah.
Almost,
but not literally dark, because that would be something.
Not literally dark, right? That's even too much of a saying what it is, but that experience of, it's almost like a black hole or antimatter or something. It's like non-being or absence. And yet there's a glow there. And so that brings, and all the other dimensions as well as the physical come out of this mystery. Really, it gets more and more mysterious the deeper we go. And then the fifth dimension, which isn't in Buddhism, but I think Vipassana is pointing to this, is what in the Diamond approach is called the logos. But this is the manifestation, this is the dynamism of being that's manifesting all of the physical reality, all the phenomena we see that come directly from the absolute, that are all the phenomena that we experience or perceive. That dynamism of manifestation that we can feel. And this is when people are feeling that blissful, almost overwhelming sensation, they're in touch with, I think this is Shakti, this would be another way of understanding it, but that energy that is manifesting the entire universe is the fifth dimension, that is the arising and passing of all phenomena.
Yeah, okay, this is exciting because this is almost precisely the model or the understanding that's taught in my tradition as well.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting!
Yeah,
wow.
and for this what we're calling fifth dimension, it's very hard to talk about because it's not actually a fifth.
It's not, it flows through the others. Right, exactly. Yeah, it is hard to talk about. This is why I think it's not in Buddhism, but like Vipassana, we're trying to see the rising and passing, rising and passing. This is the dimension they're actually trying to know directly. So yes, it is hard. Yes. So yeah, tell me more. I'd love to hear
so
how.
That, and we would say we wouldn't call this Shakti per se, because Shakti has a connotation of phenomena, the energy of phenomena. Okay. And what this is spanda or spurata, both of which mean radiant dynamism.
Yes.
That dynamism which arises as the no-thingness on the level of no-thingness, and as the clarity, and as the presence, and as the love, and as all the phenomena. So you can't say it's transcendent and you can't say it's immanent, because it's the dynamism of infinite being that makes all of that possible.
Right, exactly. That's exactly the understanding I have. Oh, these are things that give me so much confidence, because these are empirical realities. The fact that this goes in 3 traditions, and maybe there's more, like I had a rabbi once who attended one of my 2 weeks, and she said, yeah, we've got this in Judaism too. And I was thinking, tell me more, but this is, we're discovering realities that are empirically there. So I love that. That really excites me to hear that it's maps in some way onto your tradition.
Oh yeah, perfectly. It maps perfectly, right? Because also in my tradition, there's that teaching that the pure no-thingness is not ultimate, it's penultimate. Because even though there's nothing subtler, there's absolutely nothing subtler, nothing more transcendent than the pure no-thingness.
Yeah.
But it's still not ultimate, because the dynamism is what's ultimate, that's manifesting as all of these levels.
Right. So there's, like, for years I struggled with this, like, is physical reality real? Is it not real? Is it consciousness only? Of course, in Buddhism, this has been argued about back and forth. Neither and both. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes. We have this teaching that the nature of reality cannot be captured by the word existence or non-existence.
Yes.
It's both and neither vibrating in absolute simultaneity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that that's inherent in the description. Yeah.
And okay, so so just to help the listeners be clear, the 5 dimensions that you took us through, that's how it's taught in Hamid Ali's Diamond Approach.
Yes.
Right.
And then that maps onto the 4 dimensions of Buddhism, kind of. I mean, I've added with the Brahma Viharas the divine love, because I think that's what they're pointing to. And then the logos dimension is really what Vipassana is going for. So you kind of have to do a little bit of a translating, but it does map onto Buddhism as well.
Yeah. Is it 3 of the 4 formless realms map onto this model?
Yes, okay. Exactly. The base of boundless consciousness, base of neither perception or non-perception, and base of nothingness are the 3 that map directly, but the sequence is different. But I think the sequence is only different because it's easier to attain the jhana that way. I don't think it's actually like that.
Yes, and this distinction is talked about in my tradition. It's like we can talk about it in terms of kind of ontology, the order that makes sense ontologically, and then the order that makes sense experientially, how people experience it can be this other way, and that would seem to be like an uncomfortable contradiction if you have a very logical categorical mind. But the tradition says, but reality is fluid in this way, that if you look at it one way, it makes sense to make the order that like this. And if you look at it from another perspective, it makes sense to order it like that. And there is no contradiction.
Yes, that's like in Tibetan Buddhism, they really, for example, the state of cessation, which is the full absorption into the absolute, which is really important in Theravadan Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, they kind of poo-poo that because you can't function from it. So they feel that dimensions in what I said that are actually one step down from the absolute are ultimate because you can function from it. And that's what Rigpa is. So they take another, to them, if you can't function from it, then it must not be as superior. So, you can see, you can see the logic there. So, but to me, and that makes sense.
But it's not just about functioning. It's that if you can't function, it's too transcendental. Therefore, it's not all-inclusive. Therefore, it can't be ultimate.
Right, exactly. That's how they see it. And this is then where the manifestation, what we just were talking about with neither and both, you can't, this is where at some point logic and the duality of how we talk about these things, it breaks down compared to the actual direct experience of it. But we still have to make the attempt, at least, to try and describe these things. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. And yeah, I love how I can relate to how your mind works of like, oh, let's observe the parallels in these different traditions, which is a valid thing to do from an experiential point of view. Humans are experiencing, or divine consciousness embodied as humans are experiencing all of this, and it's just that one tradition doesn't see um, some things as important and sees others as more
Right.
important, and so the
Yes.
maps look a little different, but you can find these very powerful correspondences. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. At the mystical level, at the experiential level, that's where they converge. When you go out from that, even a little, they start diverging because of what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah, and it interestingly, like, you had a rabbi saying, "Oh, we have this in Judaism," but it in all the religions, it depends who is teaching. It's
Yeah, that's
lineage
right.
dependent.
That's if the more fundamentalist you get, the more they aren't at all alike. There's more rigidity. There's more my way or the highway, and yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
that
and
is,
even like you said, you weren't aware of this principle of innate dynamism that Hamid calls logos. You weren't
yeah.
aware of that in Buddhism, but there are lineages in Buddhism which do teach that. For example, with the phrase Tathagata Garbha.
Right. Yeah, I had never equated Tathagata Garbha to that,
But it
but I
depends
can.
who's teaching. It can be a reference to this innate dynamism of being to manifest in all the ways that it does, including as the no thingness. Uh,
Yeah,
if if
yeah.
if the lineage in question went that
Hmm.
far with it.
Right. Yeah, I like that. I like that. I'll have to see about, you know, bridging that with some of the Buddhist understanding. I mean, in Vipassana, they have it, but they aren't calling it out in the same way. So it's more obscured in that part of the Theravadan and Tibetan lineage with the Vipassana. But
Yeah,
yeah, this is right. There may be different ways that it takes a little bit of a jump to see the pointing at the same ultimate reality.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And in terms of the four stages of awakening in Theravada, if we can look at that for a moment, um, like you said, in the first stage, there's when it's the actual awakening, not just the experiential taste. There's a shift of identity from the psychological self, the socially constructed self, into the formless ground. That
Mm-hmm.
becomes the locus of identity, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's conceived that way mentally doesn't matter.
Right.
um, and then there's this sort of automatic, it's a tradition, so they talk in these terms. There's a sort of automatic reduction of 1/4 of your craving and aversion
Mm-hmm.
and delusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then for the subsequent three stages, they talk about further reduction of the
Mm-hmm.
so-called three defilements,
Mm-hmm.
but they also talk about it in positive terms as three subsequent shifts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what would those be?
Yeah. Well, the next one is once. It's called once returner. That's how people usually refer to it, where there's a further reduction of the suffering from the personality patterning. So the identity of those things, like believing we're the me in those ways, reduces further. I call this thinning of the me. So that goes down more. There's less suffering, and also. And I'd love to get your take on. I know we're like I feel like I could talk with you for another hour and a half, but
Yeah.
on the bodhisattva vow versus going on to liberation in the arahant model. So anyway, in this model, you're only going to have one more life as a human. That's what once returner means. And then in the next stage, non-returner. So that means no more lives as a human. Potentially one could have a life in one of the upper realms that aren't the human realm, where there's a lot less suffering, the Deva realms it's called. And at that point, there's a few more things that drop off. The defilements are really thin, but there's still a little bit left of what they translate it as conceit, but I don't think that was the right translation. I think it just means there's still a sense of the me. Exactly. There's still a little bit of a sense of the me left. And then the fourth stage is called Arahant, where at death, one's consciousness just goes back into the totality and there's no individual consciousness left. That's the Theravada model of getting off the wheel.
But are there, like you were naming some I would call them theoretical qualities, like once returner, non-returner.
Yes, I'm not sure those are accurate. So yeah.
But are there experiential qualities? Is there a way in which one's experience changes because of reaching the next stage, regardless of anything to do with reincarnation?
Yes, yeah. So the first stage, really the main shift, there's still a lot of personality material left. People are disappointed about that sometimes. Or even worse, they're deluded and think there isn't any. And now they're harming others. I mean, I think this is where the scandals come from, is people, because they know what they are. So it's a little confusing as to why is there still personality patterns arising. But, in the Theravada model, you still got your defilements. So, but there's a reduction in the suffering. And even if one gets caught up in the me again, there just isn't the belief that it's real. Even if it's arising, you can't believe it anymore. So it's like the whole reality of what it means to be a human changes permanently. So that's really I loved how you said it, the identity shifts to where it doesn't go back. That's the difference to me between awakening experiences and actual, like when I'm working with somebody to try and discern what's going on with that person, that's, and it's good to just be honest with oneself about it, And then second stage, the suffering really gets to be not a lot. And like my Tibetan teacher, he at one point gave a talk where he talked about this, where a lot of times practitioners at this level, they can sort of lose the motivation to keep practicing because there's not that much suffering. Like compared to most people, it's really small. And I felt this at times where it's like, why is practice necessary at this point? And so people actually can get stalled out there, there's nothing wrong with that at all. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but it is just one of the dangers of that stage. And then in third stage, really it's kind of a slippery slope where the me is getting so thin that a lot of and the instinctual drives, really, again, going back to the instinctual drives, it's possible, it takes a long time for those three instinctual drives to get subsumed under the enlightenment drive. And again, I think this is why we have people and even teachers acting out the sexual instinct, the self-preservation, having financial scandals or competing with other teachers, the social instinct. We're seeing them acting out their instinctual drives that chimpanzees have, And if we aren't dealing with that, it can become where those can loop around. So in the third stage, those are really subsumed greatly under the enlightenment drive, where it's really the whole existence really is about functioning from the ground of being. And that personality material just is thinner and thinner. And also the desires to live as a human are thinner. Some of the desires for a human, not through renunciation, not through a should. It's not about a should of renunciation. It's just that the inner experience is so rich that it just overshadows The,
Yeah.
and then the last stage, there's just, and people could be living normal human lives. This is one of the things that I love about the Zen ox herding pictures.
Yeah.
The return to the market, no one even knows. And you don't care if anyone knows. There's no need for any of that to be, even in third stage, there's no need to even have any of that be known. So, I think there have been a lot of masters throughout history who weren't teachers, who that wasn't their unfoldment, that wasn't their dharma, who a lot of people might not have even known.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's how I understand it. And I do believe that, what I don't like about the Theravada model, I think there are options other than the Arahant model of the consciousness going back into the ground. I think there's the possibility of a consciousness that can go on. And also there's the bodhisattva vow. So at that point, if one is really feeling the commitment to return as human and continue to help other beings, that it's going to, in my opinion, cap out at second stage. So taking the bodhisattva vow is a commitment to stay at second stage ongoingly. And if that,
Yeah.
so I don't know. I've pondered this because the traditions don't intermingle these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just a little challenge. Maybe that's too much
Okay.
conceptual mind there, because I think it's possible that, if that bodhisattva vow is powerful enough, one understanding you can find in the Vajrayana is that the vow itself becomes an energetic trajectory that spills over into life after life, meaning to
Yeah.
say there can be no trace of individuality left, and yet you still speak of that being reincarnating, even though that's
Uh-huh.
not perhaps the most literally correct phrase anymore. But it's really the bodhisattva vow that's reincarnating, right? The intention
Right,
is
right.
spilling over. And so I just think when people say, oh, you have to hold yourself back to an earlier stage instead of allowing for the unfoldment of further stages that might want to occur, I think that's a kind of mental superimposition of trying to make the
Uh-huh.
theory of the systems work, which
Right.
doesn't
Well, that I like that. I've been pondering this for a long time because at some point it actually becomes relevant, practically. So I like that you're saying that, they're, because if you look at some of the evolved beings that have incarnated, it would be easy to imagine that what you're saying is how it actually works. So yeah, I'd like to believe that's true.
Well, I just think on practically, I'm just interested in the practical dimension. There's no reason to hold yourself back when the next stage is beckoning you, just because of kind of this internalized concept of what you might need to do in order to serve beings. If the intention for service is there, it could, and it's pure, it could not
Yeah.
fail to bear fruit, even if you go on to whichever stage.
Right. Well, after awakening, the bodhisattva vow kind of becomes irrelevant because there isn't anyone else to do anything for. It's all being done for the self with the capital S.
Yeah.
So it isn't the same sense of other beings. Of course, consciousness is going to unfold for the benefit of other beings, whether that vow is there or not.
Yeah.
And whether that means taking rebirth or whether that means maybe there's the potential for some existence that's beyond the physical that can still benefit beings. Like, a lot of traditions have beings that benefit humans that aren't in the physical, but that can still be of benefit. So who knows? There's a lot of mysteries that we can only know when they happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's fundamentally mysterious. It's like however much we understand, uh, mystery will always be fundamental.
Yeah, I actually find sometimes people are disappointed to hear this, that um, the deeper one goes, I think the more mysterious it gets, not the less. You know,
Yeah.
yes, there are things that are known, but then there are so many more things. It just is so magnificent that
Yeah, and if you're
exploration.
sensing the beauty, magnificence, and perfection of the mystery, the fact that it remains mysterious is not a problem.
Exactly, right? There doesn't need to be an endpoint, like check, we're checking that box off. There
Yeah,
isn't a need for that. There's something really magnificent about that potential being endless.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's finish, if you have time, let's finish by going back through the four kinds of practice you teach. Do you have a little time for
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. There's actually six things I teach. The first is awakening. So like I have a little image of this. If you picture a mountain and awakening is at the top, sort of that being the potential for every human. And then at the bottom is embodiment. Am I living from what I've realized, or is there a gap there? And what does that mean to function from the ground of being? And then in the middle are these pathways up the mountain of the heart practices. And in the neuroscience, we know these four categories. This is one way of looking at what's being studied. Each one is doing something very different to our consciousness. So if we think of it as exercise, just like there's cardio and weights and Pilates and yoga, these are like exercise for our consciousness. Heart practices, including bodhicitta and the Brahmaviharas, the focused attention category, which is really bringing the mind stream together in a powerful, laser-like way that can cut through to a deeper reality. And that's the samatha anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. And there's other objects in that category. And then the third category is open monitoring, where we're being with phenomena as they arise and pass, cultivating a non reactivity and a non attachment and non rejection and not falling asleep to the phenomena, where there can be an equanimity no matter what's arising, both on and off the cushion. And that's Vipassana, Shikantaza. I'm sure there are others. And then the last category is the self transcending category, where we're really going directly for the non duality in an immediate way. And that includes the non-dual traditions. Advaita Vedanta, I'm sure your tradition has that, as well as Dzogchen, which is what I teach. That the Dzogchen, what I love about it, it includes all the three other categories. So they're used as building blocks for realizing Rigpa, which is the non-dual state that's being pointed at in Dzogchen.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
And we have the same four in Tantric Shaivism. Um, yeah, exactly the same, with different names, of
Wow.
course. Yeah, the heart-based practices like cultivation of compassion and these practices of seeing with and from the heart,
Uh-huh.
which helps bring authentic compassion instead of the imagination of compassion.
Yeah.
um, and then these concentration practices, all sorts, so many kinds. And then what you're calling vipassana here, like open monitoring, is what we
Mm-hmm.
call tattva bhavana, being with reality, or
Uh-huh.
even feeling into reality, because there has to be
Oh,
a
yeah.
little
I love that.
intentionality. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And then of course the fourth, the practices of um, receiving these pointing instructions that help you recognize your essence nature. It's awareness becoming aware of itself,
Yes. Uh-huh.
which is much more possible if you've done the other three kinds of practices first.
That's exactly how it is in the Dzogchen. Well, we've talked about this, that there may be a lot of overlaps there between your tradition and what it became Dzogchen. Yeah.
Yes, and
Yeah.
the difference would be that in Dzogchen it's more systematic. In
Uh-huh.
my tradition, partially because of historical accidents like Muslim conquest, colonialism, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
All these practices, which are all there, but they became kind of a grab bag. You reach into the
Uh-huh.
grab bag and pull something out instead of this systematic clarity. So I actually import the systematic clarity from Buddhism when I'm
I
teaching,
see.
but because they're all there, but as this kind of grab bag, and it doesn't work quite so well because if people want to go straight to, I want to, just
Which, of
be
course,
awareness.
we all do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and who knows what texts were lost too. You
yes.
know,
Oh, we had
that's a
a lot that
possibility
was
in your
lost
tradition. A lot was lost. So you don't know
for
if there
sure.
might have been some more systematic texts that were lost. Yeah. And then the other thing in my teaching, it's really the intersection of the two lineages of Buddhism, psychology, which is what my Ph.D. was in, and then the diamond approach of really working with doing a lot of rigorous work, including our psychological understanding, to work that personality material in the 15 hours a day we're not meditating, or 16 or more. If we're using all that off the cushion time for our practice, it doesn't take any more time if we're actually working the threads of the personality material off the cushion using inquiry and other um, off the cushion practices. That just accelerates the whole thing. So that's the other thing I include with my 18 years in the diamond approach. And I was actually in the teacher training for 8 years as well. So that is, I'm not teaching the diamond approach, but I've taken the things that go beyond that tradition that are useful for everybody. And I include that in my mainly in the working with the personality material. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, uh, is it the case that all five of these are necessary? The four types of practice we already outlined, plus working on the level of psychology to resolve whatever needs to be resolved that might be forming an impediment. Are all five necessary, or is awakening could awakening be successfully fostered, we might say, because it's never caused.
Right,
But
right.
could it be enabled or fostered by a subset of these five, or do we need all five?
Yeah, absolutely. And I put, the embodiment category is where I put the off the cushion work, because, it's embodiment, it's our life, it's the living. Yeah, well, I think awakening could happen at least first stage with any one of them. That's my sense. Everyone I know who's had awakening has had more than one category, though. And I feel just like with physical exercise, like, 50 years ago when people were telling, the medical community was saying, you should exercise, it's good for you. It was just generic, like, just do any exercise, doesn't matter, they're all good for you. And that is absolutely true. So that is kind of the answer to your question. Anything is good, they're all good. If you like one, do that. But at some point, like years later, when they started studying exercise, now there's a sophistication that if you just want to run and that's it, do that. But if you do some strength training, not only will it make your running better, but you'll be more well-rounded. And then if you do some core strength building, that's going to help you even more. And this to me is why I really recommend that people do a tour of duty in every category. Start where you're drawn to, because that will motivate you. But at some point, that flat spot needs to get worked. And like in Buddhism, the unfortunate thing, well, there's a lot of them, but one of them is that the heart practice has really been sort of relegated to the side. I don't know that that's what the Buddha intended, but in the modern time, they're really treated in a fluffy way not by everyone, but by a lot of the teachings, and not really considered core. But these are the practices that help us be in the present moment and not have to leave it when we're overwhelmed with pain in the heart. And what I found is that the main place people can't stand it is when their heart hurts, when they read the news and they're so overwhelmed that they have to shut down, or when something in their life happens that's tragic or painful, and they just can't be in the present moment because the pain in the heart's too much. So these give us a strong and robust way of relating to ourselves and others, where we don't have to go out of the present moment when things get really hard. So that's why, that's just one example of how we can get a flat spot and not be well-rounded, only doing the ones that we're the best at or that we like the most. So it's not absolutely necessary, but just like with physical exercise, we're going to be way healthier if we do well-rounded exercise than if we just do the one thing and don't do anything else. So that's how I see it. But is it necessary? No. Just like the jhanas aren't necessary for awakening, we don't have to do all of them. But I think the person's going to be happier too, and live a more, also all of the centers will be then affected, because each practice, affects our centers differently. So that's how I see it. Does this correspond to, how do you see it?
Yeah. I would say if if you want to have the best possible chance at waking up to the fundamental nature of reality, which is the same as waking up to what you fundamentally are,
Yes.
all five, the four practices we talk about plus embodiment, which includes also working with the psyche, right?
Yes, exactly. That's one of the main things there. And also the physical body, doing body-based practices. I don't
Yes.
teach those, but I'm a huge advocate of them, and I do practice them
Yes.
myself. Yeah.
And if for anyone who doesn't understand, well, why are those part of the same category? Well, but the unresolved psychic material lives in the body.
It so does. Yes,
Yeah.
it really does. And it can, like I found for myself, I had a really awful birth trauma, and the imprint, I almost died in 3 different ways. And the imprint on the psyche and the body was just so deep, because I was zero defenses, nothing, and I found that lives in the body in a way that even if all the material, the psychological, emotional material was gone, the survival instinct, if something got triggered there, the body could actually trigger that pattern. So until it got worked out of the body, which really has only just happened recently, to where the body has let go of all of those imprints, if we don't work with the body, it can at some point become a limitation, just like what you're saying. And if anyone who wants to know more, The Body Keeps the Score, that book, it's just heartbreaking to read that and to see how much that what we're saying is true. Yeah.
Yeah. And the only issue with that book is, for someone with certain kinds of trauma, it can be very triggering to read that book.
Yeah, it can. So that might not be the best place to start.
But
But
Peter Levine's books, there's several great books there on somatic experiencing. Yeah.
Well, and I do believe that all the trauma can be released from the body, no matter, I'm not an expert in this, so I shouldn't say, but one of my students who's very far along is a trauma therapist, and I interviewed her a few months ago. And anyway, I think with the trauma modalities that are being discovered now, there's more and more potential for really deep, really horrific traumas to actually be released. Again, this is what we have in our era, is we have those things, which I think are great companions for the spiritual path.
Yeah. And if anyone feels daunted by, like, it took you decades to fully resolve, as you say, only recently does it feel like it's fully resolved itself, this birth trauma. And if it took decades, that might seem daunting to someone. So would you reassure them that it's worth it?
Oh, it's totally worth it. Are you kidding? What else is there to do? Well, and I'm not saying that it's required for awakening.
No.
I don't feel it. I feel people, even with trauma, can awaken.
Of course, because your essence nature is your essence nature,
Exactly.
regardless of
So this isn't
trauma.
required for awakening. It's just, at a certain point on the path, like, it's fun. You want to do all this, it's
Yeah.
being done. Yes, it's wherever there's personality material, there's still the potential for suffering. But at some point, it's just like, this is what the human experience is for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for having fun and going to the movies and sitting on the couch watching TV, which I do.
Sure.
So, so it's
Because
not
that's
to
also the
negate.
infinite. That's just
Right,
the
and
infinite
there's
expressing as
some
that.
fun. Humans have been sitting around campfires listening to stories for thousands of for millennia. So
Yeah.
this is just our version. But so to me, it's kind of like, it's exciting to be on the path and to keep discovering places where there can be more freedom and more, like, the body can be liberated. Like, how awesome is that? That our physical bodies can be honored and liberated, and living in a body that's free from that is so amazing. So why wouldn't one? It's not, yeah, it could be daunting, but that's not, to me, at some point, that's not the place that the work comes from.
No.
It comes from the fact that more freedom keeps wanting to happen.
Yeah.
It's coming from the grounded being that is calling all of us home ongoingly. And if we listen to that call, I don't think it ever ends. But it's from a place of joy and of majesty and mystery, and like, wow, there's still more to discover. There's still more freedom possible. That's where it comes from. So it can feel daunting earlier, but what the farther reaches we're talking about, those aren't necessary for awakening.
Yeah, but also the perspective one has early on turns out to be wrong. Like you imagine yourself as a separate self who's got to climb this mountain, the mountain of resolving trauma, the mountain of attaining meditative states of samadhi or whatever, and then reaching the awakening. But and you had the metaphor of the mountain before, but of course I know you wouldn't want people to take it too literally. And the thing is, when you at a certain point you realize, oh, this is not about a separate self climbing a mountain, and
Mm-hmm.
this is about a process that wants to happen, and my job is allowing rather than striving, allowing what wants to happen. Once enough momentum is there has to be some momentum,
Yeah.
and then suddenly this this feeling of climbing a mountain is totally changed, and it feels like
Yes.
you've got this momentum and you're going, coasting. Not coasting,
Right.
but
Or actually, you've never actually moved. You've been standing one place just trying to get there.
yeah, yeah. So all the
It's all
metaphors
right
break down.
here. Right. Yeah, they do. Yeah, the mountain, it's useful because it's where people start.
Yeah,
But yes, it totally breaks down. Ultimately, it's all been the grounded being doing itself.
yeah, exactly. Of course. Yeah, and so to finish with this, the four modalities of practice plus the fifth of embodiment, which includes working with the somatic psyche, we might say,
Mm-hmm.
um, work in all five areas because to, I'll paraphrase Patrul Rinpoche here, who I
Yeah.
love, who said, if you do this, like we're working in all these ways, enlightenment is guaranteed. And even if it doesn't happen, still, what happiness, what joy.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I love his playfulness because first he says it's guaranteed, and then he says, and even if it doesn't happen.
Well, he's not saying which lifetime.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. Well, it's wonderful
mm,
to speak with you. Maybe we can
yeah, you
do
too.
more of it.
I'd love that. I'd love that. Yeah, I feel like we covered a lot of ground and there's still more possible ground to cover. Yeah.
For sure. And tell the listeners about the types of retreats. Do you do retreats for different levels of practitioner, and what are those like?
Yeah. So there's really, a few major things I do. I do several 1 week retreats on the different categories. And then I do a 2 week that is where one can either take the Dzogchen track or the Samatha. You don't have to decide it until halfway through, because we all do Samatha. I may start teaching a 3 week retreat where I would teach all 4 categories, which I teach on the 2 weeks. So all the 1 weeks I teach what is awakening program, which I do teach all 4 categories just in an overview. And I also teach about awakening in different traditions and what the process is like. And I love that, because you can be a beginner and still come to the What is Awakening retreat. So those are the retreats I teach. I also do day-longs and weekends at different venues around the country. I used to teach in Europe, and maybe that'll come back at some point, but right now it's North America. And then I have my mentoring program, my 1-year mentoring program, which is the other most popular thing that I offer, where I take people each month. We cover a topic that includes both doing the personality material work and some of what I bring in from the diamond approach, and then the categories of practice and the embodiment. So each month is a different practice or tool that I feel through the year is what is needed for a complete spiritual path. And then I do a one-on-one with people each month. So I can really work with people on both on and off the cushion, and really track your life experience and working with personality patterns over the time in your life and what's going on in your life and your relationships, work, other things. So that is very popular as well. And occasionally, if I have openings, I do one-on-ones, just a one-off if I have some extra time that month. So those are the main offerings that I have at this point. Yeah.
And that's the info on all of that is on Luminous Mind Sangha website?
.com. Yeah, luminousmindsangha.com is where you would find all of that. And I have a lot of free materials, free talks, videos. I have a YouTube channel. Luminous Mind Sangha is a YouTube channel. And then I have, I think, more than 60 free talks on dharmaseed.org. But all of this you can find at my website. And if you want to follow me on Facebook or any of these, then you would get updated when I have something new. All my events are on Facebook as well. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And you had mentioned a little while ago, you had a recent conversation with a trauma specialist.
Yeah, she's an affiliated professional with Luminous Mind Sangha.
And where is that conversation to be found?
That's on YouTube. Yeah,
okay.
That's they can see me and her talking on YouTube, and all of my talks, all of my more recent talks, and then I have one with Henry Garcia who talks about the neuroscience behind the 4 categories, and hopefully he'll be doing some more where I will be posting them on our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to finish with a little appreciation, because when we record, we see each other, but the listeners just have audio, which as I've mentioned is great, because then they can be in nature or whatever. They don't have to look at the screen.
Yes.
But I want to tell the listeners that something I noticed that's beautiful here is that when I was speaking, like I could just see you as being just totally present and clear, not like thinking, what am I going to say next? No, just present and clear. And then the moment I was done speaking, boom, then the animation came and whatever wanted to come up. And that was beautiful to see.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I could reflect the same back to you. Before we started, I said that sometimes, almost all the time, I forget that there's an interview, and I just am so happy to be talking with you and to talk to someone who understands all this. And, I really appreciate just the conversation, and I've learned things. I'm so excited to hear there's so many similarities with your tradition. it just really makes my heart sing to know that there's all these different non-pathways up the mountain.
Non-pathways up the non-existent mountain.
Up the non-mountain, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's just wonderful to speak.
You're welcome.
Okay, take care.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
You too.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.